Well, I'm joined now by the political editor of the Daily Record, David Clegg, and a comedian who's also a political commentator and former political advisor to senior Labour politicians, Ayesha Hazarika. Welcome to you both. Richard Leonard, these remarks that were very controversial that Jeremy Corbyn made, that have been criticised by Nicola Sturgeon and by Ian Murray and by Kezia Dugdale. What do you make of it? Do Labour need to tread carefully here?
They very much need to tread carefully, I think, yes. I do worry that I think that this was more a badly written line in a speech. I'm not sure that some of the context that's been taken from it is right. I think Jeremy Corbyn has spoken in the past about the way that immigration and freedom of movement could potentially lower wages. Now, you can have an argument about whether there's any evidence for that, because it's quite difficult to pinpoint that there is. But that's a different discussion than just saying we don't want migrants coming in. It's that we don't want migrants being exploited, which is a slightly different issue. Yeah.
What did you make of it? Do you agree with David? It's perhaps the language could have been different?
Well, I mean, I was surprised Jeremy Corbyn sort of went there. I think I probably agree it was quite clumsy. Look, whenever Labour makes a foray into immigration, it is incredibly controversial. In fact, when anyone talks about immigration...
Gordon Brown talking about British jobs for British workers was very controversial.
And we had this immigration mug, which went down very badly, in case you remember the 2015 general election campaign. To take a step back, immigration was a huge issue in terms of the Brexit vote. And whether, Labour members are comfortable with it or not, at some point we're going to have to come up and articulate some sort of policy on immigration. The idea of equating Jeremy Corbyn to Nigel Farage is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn, in fact, the criticism against him was that he was somebody that almost wanted open borders. Nigel Farage has said that, people from other countries, are ripping off our NHS. He said people from sort of other countries bring in diseases and things like that.
But arguably, even from inside the Labour Party, presumably the argument would be that kind of language that Jeremy Corbyn used is giving the opportunity to other organisations, whether it be the SNP or the Liberal Democrats or the Conservatives, to say, aha.
Well, I just think on that, I think any time you talk about immigration, there is that danger. What he was saying is about trying to stamp out exploitation, which we would all agree with. I mean, there's just been a list out this week of companies in the UK who are not paying the minimum wage, and a lot of the staff that are not getting the minimum wage are migrants. I say this as the daughter of immigrants. You have to protect everybody across the piece. But what I do think is also going on here is a bit of bigger politics within the Labour Party. Some people I've spoken to...
Well, I was going to say, actually, David, on that, is this in fact become, at this conference, that one sentence or half a sentence, a surrogate for actually a division over the single market?
I think this, I think actually the single market is a surrogate for a wider division between,
so it's a surrogate for a surrogate.
The hard left and moderates. I think on the immigration thing, just a final point on that quickly, which is I think it's a failure of all political parties that they haven't made the case for immigration. They've been scared about what voters think about this, so they've been very hesitant to actually say, listen, immigration is great for the country and here's why. So it leads to problems like this when you try and get into that issue. On the wider point about the single market, we've seen this being the big bun fight in the last 2 days at the Scottish Labour Party conference about the single market, about whether there was this vote this morning about whether they were going to get a vote on the single market or not. And obviously the immigration issue plays into that. But actually it's about a wider split in the party, which is between supporters of Jeremy Corbyn and moderates. The idea that the hard left suddenly is not for the single market and the moderates are all for it. They've been mapping themselves onto this division based on a wider split.
But there's also this issue of how radical Richard Leonard and Jeremy Corbyn really are. I mean, that was my point, asking Richard Leonard about PFI contracts, because it sounded like the Bolshevik Revolution in his speech. But when I asked him about it, it turns out all he really means is, oh, we'll have a chat with these companies and, we might ask them to renegotiate, but there's not much they can do if they don't want to.
It's quite interesting. There's some quite explosive sort of headlines. Then when you drill down to it, it's like, well, actually, we'll kind of do everything on a case-by-case basis. I think what you're seeing, which is quite interesting, is Jeremy Corbyn gets elected as this huge radical, this terrifying sort of radical. And as actually he's doing better and better in the polls, did better in the last general election, in a way, you actually find that the closer they get to power, or the perception, they are starting to kind of moderate their views and almost try and sort of find some compromises. And I think that is interesting politics. You could argue that is the old politics rather than the new politics. I mean, remember, Jeremy Corbyn went into the last general election campaign having campaigned against Trident his whole adult life, compromising and saying, actually, we'll put renewal of Trident in our general election manifesto.
Yeah, but the danger of that, David, for the particularly young people who've flocked to the Labour Party over the past few years is that if it turns out all this radical stuff it's really just the same as what moderate Labour is saying when it comes down to brass tacks, they're not going to be very impressed.
But I do think that there's been a distinct shift in the radical vision of what they want to do in the future. Now, when you're talking about, a private company runs, and it was in Dundee, so Ninewells Hospital is a running sore in Dundee. It's one of the few hospitals we have to pay for car parking, and a private company's making a lot of money out of it. To buy out that contract would cost a lot of money for the government, and it's perhaps not the best use of public money, which is why it's not been done by the current Scottish government. But he's saying, going forward, very clearly, we will take private companies out of the health service, and that is a definitive difference. So I think there is radical intent. Whether you can retrofit it for previous policies, I take the point that's difficult. You can't just start ripping up contracts without paying penalties. But I think there's a difference in vision, though.
We'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much. David Clegg and Ayesha Hazarika. And people can come to see you because you're a stand-up comic, not as a stand-up political advisor.
Not as a stand-up. Sometimes you could argue there was a cigarette paper between the two. Yes, I'm on tonight or in more 8 o'clock.
Right, yes. No, I'm just trying to imagine trying to sell tickets as a stand-up political advisor.
You'd be surprised. I think people think that politics and comedy are so close together right now.
We'll have to leave it there. Look, that's all from us this week. I'll be back at the same time next week. Until then, goodbye.